Marking his third visit in 6 months, the Israeli Prime Minister touches down in Washington. With sights on a ceasefire, Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump talk conditions. But with indirect Israel-Hamas talks in Doha failing, many don't hold out hope. So what will Netanyahu's White House visit achieve? And will the people of Gaza continue to suffer? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Gaza's ceasefire negotiations. U.S. President Trump has said they could reach a deal on Gaza this week, but it's not at all clear what that would entail. Benjamin Netanyahu arrived at the White House with more than Gaza on the agenda. After all, a permanent deal with Iran is also a priority, and rather than concern for stopping Israeli military action in Gaza, it seems the focus is foremost on securing the release of Israeli hostages. It all leaves Gazans with some very guarded optimism at best. Here's a look.
Could one ceasefire lead to another? And could the Israeli war in Gaza be about to turn a major corner? In the wake of a ceasefire following the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is heading to Washington, D.C.
There is also a great opportunity, and the opportunity is to expand the circle of peace, far beyond what we could have imagined before. We have already changed the face of the Middle East beyond recognition, and we have the opportunity and the ability to change it even further, and to bring a great future to the state of Israel, and to the people of Israel, and to the entire Middle East.
There is desperate hope from many in Gaza that this could be the start of an end to Israeli military action in the besieged enclave, and a much freer flow of aid and supplies. For Israelis, a desire for the release of yet more of the hostages still being held by Hamas since the events of October 7, 2 years ago. The US President spoke ahead of the meeting.
I think there's a good chance we have a deal with Hamas during the coming week, pertaining to quite a few of the hostages. You know, we've gotten a lot of the hostages out, but pertaining to the remaining hostages, quite a few of them will be coming out. We think we'll have that done this week.
The momentum for an official pause in hostilities accelerated at the start of the weekend, when Hamas indicated it was responding positively to a US-brokered proposal. Statements online from Hamas said it was ready to engage in all seriousness. A first round of indirect talks using intermediaries between Israel and Hamas took place in Qatar on Sunday. But the hope was short-lived and rapidly gave way to disappointment over the lack of any major breakthroughs, according to various news reports quoting anonymous sources familiar with both the talks and the proposal. Hamas appeared dissatisfied at the lack of a guarantee that fighting won't recommence after a proposed 60-day period, and no total withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from the territory. Further reports that the Israeli delegation didn't have sufficient authority or decision-making power also complicated the matters. Israel responded that several Hamas requests to change the proposal are unacceptable. The weekend saw Israel launch several attacks into Gaza, killing dozens and wounding more.
Right at the time of the evening call to prayer, we were surprised by screams from the neighbors. We went out to see what was happening. We found that an aircraft was hitting the tent of the children. A large aircraft descending on them and crashing them. My brother, his wife, his 4 children, my cousin's son and his daughter. 8 martyrs yesterday. 8 people are gone.
Back in Israel, protesters on the streets demanded Netanyahu do more to return all hostages still not returned. Many of the hostages are already suspected to be dead, but others are either known to be or assured to be alive. But is strained hope for a different outcome this time a reaction to signs of a longer-lasting, palpable change? Or, as has happened many times before, are Israel and Gaza bound to return once again to hostilities after a failure to agree?
So will this meeting at the White House yield a meaningful ceasefire this week? Or is the war set to continue into a third year? Joining me now to debate that and more are from Phoenix, Arizona, Palestinian activist and former spokesman for the Abandon Harris campaign, Hudayfa Ahmad. From West Jerusalem, director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, Jeff Halper. And from Birmingham, UK, Palestinian writer and analyst Kamel Hawash. Thanks all so much for being with me. First, I'd like to get your take on how much a Gaza ceasefire really is a priority here, given that the indirect talks in Doha have yielded nothing. Netanyahu really is still getting credit in Israel for taking on Iran successfully so far. And the U.S. is already moving on to really resurrecting the Abraham Accords. So, Kamel, how much are the Palestinians themselves really in the equation here?
Well, they should be the top priority because we're talking about civilians who are suffering more than anyone else and have been suffering for the last 20 months. But Netanyahu is prioritizing what he wants rather than what is needed in relation to what is happening. And I do fear that Trump, regardless of what people think of him, he's really not as well informed as people think. He's a man who doesn't really read. So it depends on which advisor he's spoken to and which piece of news he's caught. However, yes, they are trying to bring the various things together to talk about Iran, normalization agreements, whilst the IDF continues to slaughter Palestinians. So it should be the priority, and I hope it is.
You hope it is. How hopeful are you?
I think I'm more hopeful than I was, say, 3 weeks, 4 weeks ago, because the pressure on Israel from all around the world is sky high, if you like, and that the people are really beginning to not see Israel in the light that it wants to be seen in a massive way. Across the world, they see it as a murderous terrorist state, etc., which for the Israelis isn't good, but Netanyahu doesn't seem to care about that.
No, he doesn't. Jeff, I don't think you believe he really cares either, because especially within Israel, which is the only kind of feedback he would give any credence to, he's better than ever, if I can put it that way, especially after what was done in Iran.
Yeah, I think he's in a very good position, Netanyahu. Let me just say, I mean, the ceasefire is important, but I mean, in terms of Palestinian well-being, maybe some of the more active killing is going to end, but don't forget, there's still the issue of who's going to feed the Palestinians. The Israeli army is still going to be there for quite a while, if not forever, with all the violence, maybe not the same intensity, but it's still going to be an issue of law and order. How do people get food and so on? The Palestinian, there's no talk about reconstruction. So that, the ceasefire is kind of almost a minor detail in some ways. I mean, it does end this most intensive, but it doesn't remove the army. It doesn't relieve Palestinians of their suffering. So I think that's something we have to keep into mind. Otherwise, I think Netanyahu wants a ceasefire. There's a lot of pressure inside. He doesn't have the pressure in his government anymore. His government is pretty stable. But what he needs is this idea of total victory. Total victory means, and this is the idea of pacification. He came in with the idea of eliminating the last source of resistance, Palestinian resistance to occupation, to apartheid, to colonization. That's Hamas. So Hamas has to be eliminated. In other words, he can't go into a ceasefire in which Hamas remains as a military or political presence. So somehow he's got to find a way of balancing the total victory and eliminating Hamas with the fact that Hamas will not agree to be eliminated. Hamas really represents Palestinian resistance. If it was eliminated, that has tremendous implications for the Palestinians themselves and their struggle. So how that exactly gets worked out remains to be seen.
Are you at least hopeful at all, Jeff, for what could come out of this week?
No, I think they'll find some kind of a cosmetic arrangement, some wordy kind of a thing. There has to be a ceasefire. Netanyahu can't continue. Even the army is on the brink kind of mutiny to some degree. So that so there has to be a ceasefire. The question's going to be, yeah, again, how do they balance this total victory idea with Hamas's insistence that it remains somehow as a presence in Gaza?
Yeah, it's total victory. I mean, Hudayfa, you know, Netanyahu has said that Israel has changed the face of the Middle East beyond recognition, and that they have the ability now to change it even further. There seems to be, you know, a vision here that not only doesn't include, obviously, Hamas, but that doesn't even mention Palestinians. So what are you thinking going into this meeting at the White House?
I think the most obvious scenario is a 60-day deal, a temporary ceasefire for 60 days, in which we see the Israeli military pull out of much of Gaza. Humanitarian aid surges to the levels it was at the beginning of the January ceasefire. The usual exchange of prisoners from Hamas's end and from Israel's end. The key here is going to be what happens within these 60 days that each side can do to ensure that they get their goals. What can be done within these 60 days to increase the pressure on the Israeli government for a permanent ceasefire, and what Netanyahu is going to try to do in these 60 days to ensure that his government doesn't collapse. Gantz has offered Netanyahu enough MPs to keep his coalition afloat in case Smotrich and Ben Gvir walk out. But the key is going to be Hamas is most likely going to agree to a 60-day truce, just to try and maneuver within those 60 days as to how they can work towards a permanent deal once those 60 days are up. The key is going to be which media organizations are going to be allowed inside of Gaza within these 60 days in order to build up international pressure against Netanyahu and his government.
Do you really think media organizations would make any difference?
I do. And I think the reason, the biggest proof that they would make a difference is that they haven't been allowed in. Because if they had been allowed in, the horrors that we'd see would be transmitted to that media organization's local audience in their local language. And the horrors would be untold in that regard. There's a reason they haven't been allowed in, and there's a reason there's been a constant effort to vilify and discredit local Palestinian journalists. It's a big part of Israel's playbook.
Okay. I just have to ask Jeff quickly. I mean, would any more intensified or disturbing images make any difference in Israel?
No, they don't come through in Israel at all. You don't see those disturbing images. They're not an issue here. Nobody cares about the Palestinians or any of that. It all has to do with the hostages. That's 100% of the discussion here. The hostages and the Israeli soldiers that are being killed. We have to remember that in the last month, since the fighting renewed, about 30 soldiers have been killed, which is a big thing for Israel and for Israelis. So I think that's a major factor in terms of the ceasefire, I think, going ahead.
Okay. Kamal, let me come back to you, because if there is a 60-day ceasefire negotiated, aid is returned to some level to Gazans, then what? We spoke before about the fact that there is no day after plan. I mean, does Trump still want to own the Gaza Strip? Is that effectively the only day after plan on the table? And what would that even mean?
Yes, I mean, first of all, on the aid issue, there are two separate issues. One is sending the aid in, and then how it is distributed. We've seen this organization, this foundation, the Inhumane Foundation that was set up, failed to deliver in quantity and to different locations, because it was only in certain locations. And it has served to humiliate the Palestinians, which is not a very helpful thing going forward for Israel. So I think that it's important the aid goes through, and that it is UNRWA and the other organizations that are allowed, if I can put it that way, to distribute it, to give the Palestinians some relief. But the hope will come from the political developments that happen. Is Israel really serious about finding a long-term solution, and who might be involved? It can't have sort of local clan leaders running Gaza, which is what Netanyahu wants. He has said he doesn't want it to be Hamasistan and he doesn't want to be Fathistan. So what does Israel want it to be? But then what is the best arrangement going forward if we are going to move from an end to the war to then some reconstruction, or at least in the meantime, lots of mobile housing units for people to live in a modest sort of way, and then to start the educational system and so on. But there seems to be different suggestions for what happens. But what the Palestinians want is Palestinian administration of Gaza, not to have others ruling them, or for that matter, to have Arab armies coming in, because they want to be able to run the situation themselves. On the Palestinian side, that is where there is a problem, because the Palestinians do not come to this in a united way. At the moment, Hamas is negotiating. Abbas, I think, thinks that once the war ends, he is the boss, and therefore he should have the rule over Gaza. But what they need is the following. We need the PLO, not the Palestinian Authority, together with Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, being the group that forms what happens next. Because even the issue of an administrative committee that Egypt and the Arab states suggested, there seems to be some skepticism about who would be involved and how much they can do. But the biggest problem is, when it comes to the next bit, Israel is still in control of the borders. It will control what comes into Gaza. The rebuilding could take a few years, or it could take decades if Israel blocks what is needed to rebuild the Gaza Strip. And as for Trump, you asked me about whether he wants Gaza. I think deep down, and of no doubt Jared Kushner behind the scenes is pushing to say, yes, let's get rid of the Palestinians and rebuild this in an image that we can use as property holders.
Okay. Hudayfa, a lot to take in there. But I mean, as far as the day after plan, if there is one, is concerned, it would have a lot to do with internal Palestinian unity. And as Kamal was saying there, these various armed groups that have now formed, they're even causing complications for Hamas. And Hamas, if it is destroyed, according to whatever Israel's definition might be, so that Netanyahu can claim victory over something, what has been left then? Is it more chaos? We've often talked about what? You destroy Hamas only to leave the ideology, and more chaos because you don't have a single entity to at least negotiate with.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that there are 3 armed gangs currently operating in Gaza with Israeli protection, 2 of which are having their salaries paid by the Palestinian Authority, one in Rafah under Abu Shabab, one in Gaza City, and one, I believe, in Khan Yunis. The last 2 that I just mentioned have their salaries being paid by the Palestinian Authority, which has proved itself to be complicit in Israel's war on Gazan society. And so it's very important to understand, when you talk about the day after, there's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of talk that's done for, cosmetic purposes, showmanship purposes. What's important to understand, and I'm glad that the Palestinian Authority was brought up, is that these groups that are being armed inside Gaza aren't part of a liberation project. They're collaborators used to fragment the Palestinian resistance and civil cohesion. And so when the PA starts cutting checks to factions that are raiding hospitals and conducting house raids under Israeli direction, they forfeit any legitimate claim to represent the Palestinian people. With regard to aid, and GHF was brought up, and if a ceasefire holds, GHF's days are numbered, and that's a good thing, because the deal would restore distribution to real humanitarian agencies and cut them out. They have a vested interest in ensuring that a ceasefire does not happen, because it threatens millions in profits for a contractor that has turned hunger into a war tactic. They haven't just failed. It's functioned as a tool of the genocide, and that's very important to understand. Haaretz has already called their food lines killing fields, and whistleblowers, U.S. contractors, admit that U.S. staff surveil starving civilians, and they share suspicious identities with the IDF. So a ceasefire that holds must include dismantling GHF entirely, and anything less is, quite frankly, complicity.
Jeff, do you think Israel would be willing, or Netanyahu and his administration would be willing to give up the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, or is there too much vested and cynical interest in allowing it to operate and being in control of aid distribution, whether or not it costs hundreds, if not thousands, of lives? It's not of their interest. Their interest is having that control over that organization.
I don't think I don't think we should overestimate the importance of Gaza. I mean, obviously the human issue is very important, but politically, Gaza is marginal to Israel. It's a part of a pacification process that is paving the way towards normalization between Israel and the Arab world. This is the bigger context in which Gaza is happening. So Israel has an interest in destroying Hamas as a resistance group, and then Israel is going to walk away. It'll always have military control. It doesn't care about the day after. The day after, if the Palestinians are all removed to Libya, that's fine. If they remain under any kind of foreign rule, that's fine. Israel does not want to administrate Gaza, and I think it feels it can control Gaza from the outside very easily. So I don't think Gaza and the Palestinians do not interest Israel at all. This was all intended as a pacification campaign to break the resistance. And don't forget, this is also happening in the West Bank. Israel's talked about the Gazification of the West Bank. All of this is to create a kind of an industrial quiet in which there is no more resistance. And then that creates conditions by which Saudi Arabia, especially, can then enter into the Abraham Accords. Don't forget, there's a double agenda today in Washington. One is a ceasefire in Gaza. The other one is going back to the Abraham Accords, the normalization process. These two things are compressed into one thing. So Gaza is simply a step towards the end game for Zionism after all these decades, which is finally normalizing its Judaization of Palestine.
What I don't understand, though, Jeff, is as you say, Israel really doesn't care about administering Gaza. I mean, how can they not care or be more aware of the potential fallout longer term for the damage, and I'll call it the cycle of revenge that's being created here? They've thrown so many millions of people into total desperation and the anger of having lost and suffered. And so that's going to spread, likely, I would say, across the Palestinian territories and abroad to who knows what could be created in the future that would come back to haunt Israel at this point over this. Do they not consider that? Is that completely out of the equation, the long-term effects?
No, that's out of the equation. I think Israel, they live in a bubble. As long as, their own security is guaranteed, and you could see, in the war with Iran, the triple domes protecting Israel were pretty effective. Yeah. I think Israel knows that it has the backing of the United States, really of the international community. We have to also keep in mind, even though the BRICS countries have called for a ceasefire, Israel has very close relations with China, with India, with Russia, so that it's even covered from that point of view. And I think the Palestinians are isolated because I don't think the Arab governments care about the Palestinians. Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia said to Anthony Blinken, "I don't care about the Palestinians." So I think they're in a situation where I don't know if they would have the power. Now, what they do have is the power to mobilize the international community. And that's where I go back to Kamal's point that if there was a PLO and if there was a real political program, the Palestinians would really have leverage in terms of blocking normalization and going back to their resistance and to the Palestinian struggle for liberation. But without that, they're kind of lost, right? In many ways.
And therefore, Kamel, Israel will be able to continue to kind of work around the Palestinians. We're hearing things on the agenda as well, that there could be border talks between Israel and Syria. They could be looking at, as we said, reestablishing the Abraham Accords. It's as if Palestinians they're not there.
Well, first of all, they are working on the Abraham Accords. I mean, in Lebanon, there seems to be quite a bit of pressure being applied for Lebanon to come to some sort of agreement, including the Abraham Accords with Israel. Syria, there's a sort of a lull. We don't hear much, but there's a lot of talk about normalization. So yes, that is definitely on the agenda. But I do think, just to add to Jeff's perspective on the isolation of the Palestinians, Israel is being isolated. Yes, the leaderships in different countries are with Israel completely. Let's be clear. I'm in the UK. Whatever our Prime Minister says, just to pacify, if you like, some of his voters, unfortunately, Britain fully supports Israel, with even the parts for the F-35 plane that they tried to dodge and say they go to different sort of countries, but they're still going to the planes that are dropping the bombs on the Palestinian people. But I do think that what Israel has succeeded in is moving the dial towards total isolation by the people. Even when Israelis, and I mean individuals, shouldn't really be targeted for what their government does. But when they go to different countries, they are being now identified, especially if they've served in the IDF, as some of them admit, because of the horrendous things that they've done, and they are being isolated. I predict that to grow.
Kamel, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of you really so much for joining us, and our viewers for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.